So I feel like the Lord is leading me to share my story and to catch you up. If you're just jumping in at this point, I have accepted the Lord at almost age 13, last week in October 1977. And I've enjoyed a great year with the Lord, learning and growing and being encouraged, learning how to hear His voice, reading His Word. It's been tremendous. And now I am up to the last weekend in October 1978. Almost a year, it could be just about to the day, since I tentatively raised my hand and asked Jesus to come into my life and make a difference at that Sunday night service. I need to give you my family geography just a little bit as background. My mom was an only child, so there's no aunts, uncles, cousins on mom's side at all. Dad was the middle kid of 5, 2 older sisters, 2 younger brothers. So my cousins on that side break down really by decade. There's the 50s kids, 4 of them born in the 1950s. The youngest one of that group, Sandy, is 5 years older than me. And then there's us 60s kids. Right on, brother, peace. And there's 4 of us, including my brother, in the 1960s. And then there's 2 70s kids to round out my cousins. The 50s kid that we're going to look at today, his name was Rick, and he was 6 years older than me. So in 7th grade, when I was finding the Lord and learning and growing, as a 7th grader, he was a senior, going through a lot of the same maneuvers as me. He's a couple years ahead of me, I think, on the God front. While being 6 years ahead of me in school, he graduated and was working on his dad's farm. Well, this last weekend in October, he called up and said, "Hey, let's go squirrel hunting." So myself, Dad, my younger brother Scott, a friend of his, Dave, all jumped in a vehicle, went up to my uncle's farm, and it was just Rick and I that rode in Rick's car to the field where we were going to start hunting squirrels from. Having just preached through the book of Job like a month ago, God gave me such a tremendous first year with Him. I think what you're about to see happen is like with Job, God letting down a hedge and saying, "Okay, I know this guy can go through what he's about to go through. And it won't seem like it, but it's for his own good." Does that feel ominous? It should. Rick and I went down one side of the mountain. Dad, Scott, and Dave went down the other side of the mountain. Now, on the way up in the car, Rick had been talking to me. This is a 19-year-old to a 13, almost 14-year-old, telling me about future plans, about a girl that he liked. He just unloading and talking to me. Rick and I were friendly, but he was sharing. I was like, wow, this is great. I didn't know what to say, but I listened. We went down our side of the mountain. Rick, 5'10", curly red hair, he got out ahead of me, and I came down behind. And a squirrel was running between us, and I jacked a shell in my lever action 22, and I pulled up, and as the squirrel ran towards Rick, I was like, "Oh no, this is bad idea. Started bringing the gun down, my fingers still on the trigger. Tried to bring the gun up, actually, because Rick was downhill from me. And I stumbled, hit that trigger, and one shot went off. And I'm wondering if, just like Satan did to Job and just piled it on when he got the chance, he made that one bullet. I don't know if it's Satan. I can't blame him. It was my stupid error. Should not have my finger on the trigger. It hit Rick in the carotid artery. His neck blew that up, and the portion in there between the carotid artery and his lungs, and the doctor said he bled to death. He drowned in his own blood, bled right into his lungs. And what I was told afterwards, and I don't know if it was to make me feel better or it was the truth, that even if they'd had an operating table right there, they wouldn't have been able to save him. I don't know if that made me feel any better or not, to be honest with you. The next year, I don't remember much. I remember the funeral. It was late 70s, so it was still one of those 3-day affairs, 2 days of 2 days of visitation where the lines just stretched down the sidewalk. And then the funeral at church. There was no counseling back then. And as you might guess, my whole family was just blown into grief. Nobody to talk to. Except the Lord. My emotions were all over the place. Sometimes felt like I was feeling 20 emotions at once. Sometimes there was grief and depression so deep it was just like I was being shoved underwater and held there. Anger at myself, anger at the situation. All kinds of emotions this short, skinny kid is just going through. And then there would be long stretches of just nothing where I felt like I'd never feel again. And then a lot of this, it was just, God, am I going crazy? Am I going crazy? God, I feel like the bottom's just gone. I need you to hold me up. Help, Lord. And that was, months. And then started to come out of it, and God started to dig into me as I let him deeper. I had to let him deeper. I had no one else. Let him deeper into my life. He started to show me that my anger came from fear, and that I didn't have to fear, because he would never leave me or forsake me, no matter what thing I did, stupid, idiotic, wrong. He was gonna be there, and I could trust him. We spent hours out on the wood pile, just me driving that splitting maul through the wood and just begging him for help. We spent hours sitting, looking out the window, feeling nothing at all. And in that time, God built inside of me a relationship that was saved my life. I'll be honest with you. You look at that kid from a year, 2 years ago, haunted by anger and fear, out of control, frustrated, and then you put this accident on top of it. I wouldn't have survived my teen years. I'd have killed myself. Without God, I'd be dead, and I wouldn't be talking to you today. He saved my soul, and then he saved my life. And that is a huge part of my story.